It's been a decade since Elon and his followers returned from the lost city of Atlantis with the blueprints to the fifth mode of transportation that would whisk us all into the fairy tale future. Do you remember what was promised? People from ages 1 to 100 could travel in a futuristic pod at speeds exceeding commercial airlines, aka over 1,000 kilometers an hour or 620 miles per hour. And it would also cost significantly less than traditional, disgusting, boomer-era technology of high-speed rail. Also, it would run on clean, carbon-free electricity, and it would have 16 times the detail of Fallout 4, and it would generate more energy than it uses. Wait, did he just rewrite the laws of physics drafting his Hyperloop proposal?
It's a conspiracy.
Apparently so. Was it hard? Nope. It was super easy, barely an inconvenience. What's actually going to happen is they plan on installing more solar panels and wind farms along the Hyperloop than they need to, so they can claim the whole system generates a surplus of energy. By that logic, a Tim Hortons can generate 1,000,000 times more energy than it uses by building a nuclear reactor in the parking lot. Give that man all the Nobel Prizes. I'm sure he had some spare time to invent Hyperloop while simultaneously solving climate change, traffic jams, bridging general relativity with quantum mechanics, and setting up his Mars colony. Okay, fine. So what got me triggered today? Well, I saw this article a while ago where the Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, he looked at the awe-inspired masses and then looked at his dismal approval ratings and boldly endorsed the potential concept of at some point in the future considering to build a Hyperloop between the two sibling sisters of Wild Rose country. Clearly he was getting desperate.
Reviewing me.
And a few months later, his own party members voted him out, which is the perfect metaphor for those still on this hype train. For those of you who aren't familiar with Alberta, the province has more than 4 million people, but 1/3 live in Edmonton, the province's capital, and another third live in Calgary, the sister city about 300 kilometers away. Both have urban populations of over 1 million and metropolitan populations of over 1.5 million each. In short, these two cities appear to be prime candidates for rapid transit. Of course, terrain will greatly affect the speed at which we can travel. That's why you don't see so many hyperfast trains going through mountain chains. So let's take a quick peek at the terrain between Edmonton and Calgary. And oh my god, it's as flat as my subscriber count. Yes, Alberta's prairies have the topography California and Austria would kill for. At least from a train building standpoint, not a tourism standpoint. That means that not only does Alberta have excellent terrain for high-speed rail, but it has two excellent candidate cities spaced almost 300 kilometers, or 186 miles, apart. The perfect distance, with large enough populations to sustain high-speed rail. And rather than investing meaningful time and meaningful money, and existing tech, like real, actual existing tech, hey look, let's wait on all that and build a Hyperloop instead. But anyways, I had a cold shower, and I let it go. But then, a few months later, I see this article of people in Waterloo, Ontario, drooling over their own Hyperloop tests, possibly with university money from people's tuition, and I got triggered again. So triggered, I rewrote the whole script to explain why, barring a few small details here and there, Hyperloop is stupid and shouldn't be taken seriously. I mean, no offense to journalists who insist they be taken seriously, but you aren't excused from the realm of critical thinking just because you are covering Hyperloop development. Especially not in 2022. First of all, here is a quick background. The Hyperloop is a train, pod, trademark pending, that travels inside a giant metal pipe at close to 0 atmosphere. The lack of air resistance means objects can travel stupidly fast. So the idea is that if you can simply bring the efficiencies of space travel down to the surface,
it's a conspiracy.
You will be able to get from LA to New York or Toronto to Vancouver in less time than an Air Canada flight, even when they take off on time. Given the fact that surface travel is inherently more convenient and that Hyperloop will be cheaper than rail for some reason, and more environmentally friendly, it's no wonder the idea spread so quickly as the magical solution to all our transportation and climate issues. So what's my problem? Well, there are actually two. The first is that, regardless of what anyone is saying, the tech isn't just a few years away from working, it's more likely at least a few decades from working.
Oh.
Getting a pod to travel uncomfortably to less than 300 kilometers an hour isn't really an improvement over rail technology developed during the first Trudeau administration. You know, back when the Montreal Canadiens could actually win a Stanley Cup. What is even more sad to see is that everyone hyping the Hyperloop project is describing it as something dreamt up by the genius of geniuses, Dr. Professor Elon Musk, or Bond villain depending on who you ask. In reality, the Hyperloop is just a copy-paste of a slightly earlier 2004 concept of a vacuum train, just with a catchier name. Oh wait, no, sorry, I didn't mean 2004, I meant 1904. Yep, that's right. The Hyperloop was conceived before women's rights. Even more depressing is that Elon's supposed breakthrough idea of air cushion skis was so bad that it was promptly dropped by those who took up the project and has since been retconned out of history, like the original founders of Tesla and Disney's racist videos from the 40s. That meant that Elon's only serious contribution to the project was its sexier branding. Which makes sense, because that man oozes sex. So instead of using Elon's idea of a pod on an air hockey table, the preferred method of Hyperloop locomotion is with magnetic levitation technology, also known as Maglev. The tech involves no moving parts and is simply a bunch of magnets that glide a pod, also known as a train, because let's be honest here, it is a train, over rails to its destination. By not having friction from the traditional wheels, you can go faster. Now do this inside a giant vacuum pneumatic mailing tube like from the 60s and boom, you've got mail. And while you might think this is truly revolutionary space-age technology, using magnets to move trains, you're kinda right. Literally, this tech was revolutionary when humans first traveled to outer space. Specifically, in the 1960s. So when you see engineers on Hyperloop projects working on magical magnetic levitation tech, just know that until they can make a fully functional and fully passenger-equipped pod travel at over 300 kilometers an hour over long distances, they will have only caught up to a train that's been doing so since it was sped up in 1965. Yikes. So what's my problem? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the first problem is the tech. You must engineer a safe and reliable giant pneumatic mailing tube and pod/trains that can deliver safe and reliable,
and also comfortable,
travel in a vacuum at speeds over 1,000 kilometers an hour. You also need said mailing tube to be able to withstand all of North America's natural weather phenomena, including tornadoes, hurricanes, grizzlies, and that angry or deranged man with an incredibly easy to find firearm that can shoot even a small hole that will cause the air to gush into the tube and kill everyone inside as if they were rammed into a brick wall. Now I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it might take more than a few years to solve all of these problems. I don't know how long, because I'm not an engineer, but I will say that even if you've managed to make a functional and safe Hyperloop, the second problem is something you won't be able to engineer away. It's a problem that doesn't discriminate or take prisoners. That problem is economics, and she is a cruel mistress. She takes a lot of ideas that can seemingly work well on the surface and takes a huge steaming dump on them if she isn't satisfied. Like communism. I know it'll totally work in your country if you are in charge. I see you've come back for another session with Lady Economics. I guess some people enjoy the pain. Where was I? Oh yes, even if Hyperloop works as advertised with a cruising speed of 1,000 kilometers an hour, or 620 miles per hour for all the Yanks in the audience, it still wouldn't be economically viable and therefore probably won't be built outside of a couple of dictatorships with stupid amounts of money and no public accountability, like the Persian Gulf or China. That's one way to assert dominance via tube measuring contests. Oh boy. But for the rest of us who actually get a say in where our tax dollars go, at least once every 4 years, well maybe only the 40% of us every 4 years, or 40% of the half that show up to vote, but okay look, you know what I mean. Where politicians must answer to the people, we don't have much tolerance for such exuberance. But even worse is that if Hyperloop ever becomes a real thing, these projects will not be covered by underpaid interns at CTV, but instead by real journalists. And they might ask silly questions like, How do you tell everyone Hyperloop will be cheaper to build than traditional high-speed rail when it's a Maglev train inside plumbing? And those cost more than HSR. And there's no good answer. So for those of us adults in the room, let us admit reality right now. Even using the most generous figures that we have on Maglev construction costs, building a Maglev train is almost twice as expensive. As for the relative cost of Hyperloop, as far as those of us living in reality are concerned, it must be at least twice as expensive as Maglev, because you are literally building a Maglev train and then placing it inside a very, very special tube that is hundreds of miles long and is completely resistant to the elements. Not to mention the pumps that are needed to achieve the vacuum and the seals at each station that safely reunite your pod with the atmosphere with more of a hug than a face punch. Land acquisition cost. The term strikes fear in the heart of any public project. The term refers to the cost of compensating private owners for the land and buildings that are being taken over by the government in order to complete whatever public works project is needed. In the case of a 300 or a 600 kilometer train, these costs will be enormous unless you can run the train as much as possible around existing rights of way and government-owned land. But since existing roads and rail lines were built to accommodate much slower traffic, that means trains and hyperloops that want to keep land acquisition costs down will need to slow down for all the twists and turns, especially in and around urban environments. This means the average speed of the train will fall, undercutting Hyperloop's main selling feature. In order to keep the average speed high, you've got to make turns with an extremely large turn radius to keep the G-force comfortable, which will necessitate expropriating an eye-popping amount of land, not to mention the lawsuits that will follow. Admittedly, the latter won't be an issue in China or the Gulf states, where Hyperloop is most likely to be built. So you want a visual representation of this turn radius? Fine. Virgin Hyperloop says that they will slow down to only 360 kilometers an hour around turns, tacitly admitting that whipping around turns at Mach 1 isn't realistic. Even at these speeds, you're looking at a turn radius of over 1.3 kilometers. In other words, to get from one point on the circle to the next at speeds traditional HSR can handle, you've got to bulldoze everything along the line to get there. Good luck selling that to the public. Therefore, the promise of urban travel, like hopping on a Hyperloop from Calgary at the start of your lunch break, arriving 30 minutes later in Vancouver for some authentic Chinese food, and then Hyperlooping back only 10 or so minutes late, but hopefully your boss won't notice, yeah, that is definitely a pipe dream. Sorry, but it looks like you're stuck with a Subway sandwich. Let me give you an example of how the shiny CGI clashes with reality. Remember this illustration from before? This was published in the University of Toronto magazine. In this picture, we see the Hyperloop running along Spadina Avenue at Harbord Street in Toronto. Okay, very fancy. Except one question, where is it going? To Castelloma? In order to turn that thing around, you're going to have to plow half of the annex just to link the Hyperloop with the existing rail line, where I am assuming it will continue onwards towards Ottawa and Montreal. I hope that the people living there won't mind. I count almost 100 homes that will need to be expropriated. That's almost $100 million and an entire neighborhood wrecked, just for this one turn. You see, it's the small details like this that get to me. These costs alone should disqualify Hyperloop, but for the sake of argument, let's continue and, more generously, let's assume that Hyperloop will only be twice as expensive as Maglev, which in turn is twice as expensive as conventional high-speed rail. Yes, I know that is a rough guess, but not as rough as some Hyperloop tests so far. Second, I will look at speed. Hyperloop really cares about speed. About going so much faster than rail and even going a little faster than commercial airlines. This stuff just absolutely woos journalists. So let's say the Hyperloop can reach a cruising speed of around 1,000 kilometers an hour. And let's also say that your traditional Boeing or Airbus airliner can go around 900 kilometers an hour. No, don't give me exact figures, I don't care. This is just a very rough estimate, and yes, I know about the jet stream. Moving on, let's put Maglev up there at 450 kilometers an hour. I said quiet. I know that some go faster and others go slower depending on the terrain, and that the average speed is lower since you must spend time speeding up and slowing down at stations, but then again, the same will go for Hyperloop. Finally, let's put traditional high-speed rail up there at 300 kilometers an hour, which is so conservative, I am hoping even Bombardier can build those trains. With the Paradise train and decent population, how long does a trip take from Calgary to Edmonton? Currently it takes about 3 hours to travel by car, give or take depending on traffic, as well as your destination. But we're gonna round. So how long would high-speed rail take? Well, assuming it takes about 5 minutes to speed up to 300 kilometers an hour and another 5 minutes to slow back down to 0, based off YouTube videos I found like the Indiana Jones I Am, the trip will take 65 minutes-ish. I know it won't maintain 300 kilometers an hour for almost an hour straight, so let's assume the max speed is a little higher than 300 to compensate for the dips around the turns. After all, many trains in Europe can go 325, so let's just round the entire number to 60 minutes for simplicity's sake. That's 2 hours faster than driving. That's plenty of time to catch a connecting bus or train to your destination, provided you aren't going to chug moonshine somewhere in the countryside. And not to mention HSR will actually be compatible with existing infrastructure, so all in all, not bad. What about Maglev? Assuming politicians are okay splurging on this technology, which they probably shouldn't, but I mean if they're willing to consider Hyperloop, then we should at least entertain Maglev. Once again, going detective mode, I found out it takes the Shanghai Maglev roughly 3 minutes to comfortably accelerate to 450 kilometers an hour, which means it would take a Maglev train only around 45 minutes to get from Edmonton to Calgary. I am not including the weight of Edmontonians, its egos, nor the inferiority complex of Calgarians. That being said, 45 minutes to connect the two are exactly what the Hyperloop was hoping to accomplish according to the article.
Maybe because it's all Maglev.
What, who said that?
So how quickly can Hyperloop get conservative legislators out of the NDP heartland and back to their base? Well, let's say it takes 5 minutes to comfortably accelerate to 1,000 kilometers an hour, because I said so, because no one has done it yet and I'm being generous here. Then it will take about 25 minutes. By golly, Elon has figured it out. He truly is a genius. Why this incredible oh, wait a minute. I forgot to add at least 15 minutes to the total to take into account the time it takes for the pumps to suck the atmosphere out and then to put it back in at the end. And depending on who you ask, this might be a generous number. That brings us up to 40 minutes. And then you have to count the time spent on airport-style security because, as I mentioned earlier, security must be NASA level since even one crack in the hull can destroy the entire train and maybe the entire plumbing tube itself. So I'm going to add another 15 minutes for security, even though it might easily be more than half an hour. That means Hyperloop will take 60 minutes to get from Calgary to Edmonton, which is slower than Maglev and just as fast as conventional, boring old boomer high-speed rail. Now when you consider the costs, no one who is even half conscious will build the Hyperloop. Hear that whip? Mistress Economics is here and she says you've been very naughty. Also, if you disagree with my numbers, please feel free to correct my uneducated self in the comments section below. But at its core, my thesis is that you don't need to invent sci-fi tech to solve the problems of rapid public transportation between the only two places in Alberta most of us have heard of. You can literally use 1980s technology at a small fraction of the cost. So yes, that means that the only reason a high-speed train between Edmonton and Calgary doesn't exist is because of the lack of political will or demand by car-loving Canadians. If you're one of those train-loving nerds, myself included, that's quite the bummer, I know. So finally, what about the Hail Mary? What about the ridiculous claims of being able to go across 1,000 miles or more? What about going from Ottawa to Vancouver? Yes, some people initially regurgitated this nonsense as being realistic over the next couple decades. To which I say, just fly. Yes, fly. The tech is over a century old and it works just fine. No tunneling through mountains, no bridging over lakes, rivers, and valleys. Just good old-fashioned flying over everything, with infrastructure needed only at each end. No 4,000 kilometers of giant pneumatic mailing tubes across a continent, just 2 so-so airports and some air traffic controllers here and there. See, I've saved you $500 billion. You're welcome. And you won't even have to destroy half the environment maintaining a straight line for your giant tube. So to wrap up my dunkfest on the Hyperloop, I just want to say that sure, let the students from the universities have their fun. Sure, let them come up with Maglev innovations that can actually be used in the real world. But for the love of journalism, can we please start being a little more critical with our coverage? And can we please stop delaying meaningful investments in public transit because people are seriously convinced that the Hyperloop will solve all our problems? Thank you for attending my TED Talk. Please like and subscribe. I need to take a Tylenol.